The wind carried the scent of wet earth and dying campfires through the empty plains. The sun had slipped beyond the western ridges, leaving behind a streak of amber light that bled into the gray sky. Along the muddy trail leading into the forgotten town, two figures stood in silence, the last remnants of two worlds that were never meant to meet. One was a woman, her pale dress clinging to her like a ghost's memory. The other, a warrior whose eyes carried the storms of his people and the silence of the land itself. The town behind them was little more than a shadow of what it once was. Broken fences, half-burned signs, and the remains of a saloon whispered of lives that had come and gone. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed, lonely and restless. The woman's breath trembled in the cold, and her hair, damp from the evening rain, clung to her neck. She had not spoken for a long time, not since the gunfire ended and the dust settled on the lifeless road. He stood before her, tall and motionless, his chest rising slowly beneath the rough leather that covered him. His skin bore the marks of battle, faint scars like trails of thunder across his shoulders. In his hand, he held his cloak, worn by wind and time, the last thing of warmth he owned. His gaze didn't waver. It was not pity that made him hold it out to her. It was something older, something deeper, as if the spirits themselves had guided his hand. She stared at the cloak, her fingers trembling. The chill of the plains cut through her thin dress, yet she didn't reach for it. Perhaps she didn't understand why he would offer such a thing. To her, he was an enemy, one of the people her father had warned her about, fierce, untamed, proud. Yet now, standing before him, he seemed not a monster of stories, but a man made of earth and breath, capable of mercy. He didn't speak. The Apache warrior had learned that words often failed between those born under different suns. Instead, he stepped closer and placed the cloak around her shoulders. It was heavy with the scent of smoke and leather, a scent of life in the wild. She froze, unsure whether to thank him or fear him. The warmth of it spread through her trembling frame, and for a brief moment she felt something she hadn't felt since the night her home burned safety. When she finally met his eyes, she saw no hatred there, only quiet strength. He had risked everything to bring her out of the valley where his people had fought her kind only hours before. She had seen him then, standing in the storm of bullets, his voice rising above the chaos, commanding his men to spare the innocent. He had found her among the ruins, alone, her face streaked with ash and tears. He could have left her, but he didn't. She tried to speak, but her voice failed. There was so much to say, gratitude, fear, confusion, yet none of the words felt right. The warrior turned slightly, scanning the dark horizon where the mountains rose like old sentinels. The night was coming fast, and with it the cold. He knew she would not survive long without shelter. He motioned toward the ridge ahead, where a faint light flickered between the rocks. "Fire," he said softly, his voice deep and steady. One word. That was all. But it carried the weight of everything she needed to hear, a promise that she was safe, at least for tonight. They walked in silence. The mud clung to their boots, and the sound of the wind filled the empty spaces between their footsteps. The woman kept glancing at him, trying to understand. Every movement he made seemed deliberate, shaped by patience and pride. He walked as though he carried centuries of sorrow with him. She wondered if he had a name, a family, a home left behind in the hills. When they reached the campfire, he knelt and began to build it higher, feeding it with dry twigs and brush. The flames caught, painting his face in gold and shadow. She sat across from him, wrapping the cloak tighter around her body. The warmth crept into her bones, easing the pain in her shoulders and the tremor in her hands. "You didn't have to," she finally whispered. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Cold kills faster than bullets," he replied. His English was rough but clear. The answer caught her off guard. She had expected cruelty, indifference, not concern. Her eyes softened, and for a fleeting second, their gazes met in quiet understanding. Two strangers, divided by war, sitting on opposite sides of the same fire. The warrior leaned back, staring into the flames. The crackling light danced in his eyes, revealing a story she couldn't yet read. The woman watched him carefully. There was something noble in the way he carried himself, something that made her heart tighten. He was not like the others she had heard about. There was no arrogance, no thirst for revenge, only quiet resolve. She She wanted to ask his name, but her courage faltered. Instead, she whispered, "Why did you help me?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on the horizon, where the last traces of daylight faded. Then he said quietly, "Because I saw you cry for the dead." Her breath caught. She remembered that moment, kneeling beside her father's body, clutching his hand as the soldiers fled. She hadn't known anyone was watching. The warrior's voice carried no judgment, only truth. "Your people fight with fire," he continued, "but they do not listen to its silence. You looked at death as one who feels it." She lowered her eyes, her throat tightening. He spoke as though he understood pain, as though he had lived it. Perhaps he had, many times over. The night grew colder, and the stars began to bloom above them. Fire's warmth mixed with the scent of pine and smoke. She could feel his gaze on her again, steady and curious. There was something unspoken between them. Not love, not yet, but a strange connection that neither could explain. He reached for a small pouch at his side and took out a strip of dried meat, offering it to her. She hesitated, then accepted. Hunger overcame pride. He nodded once, almost approvingly, before returning his attention to the fire. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind hummed softly, carrying whispers from the valley below. The woman watched the shadows dance across his face, wondering what kind of life could forge someone so strong yet so quiet. As the fire dimmed, he rose to his feet and stepped toward the edge of the ridge. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the land, revealing the vast emptiness ahead. He stood there like a figure carved from stone, his hair swaying in the wind. She wanted to ask him where they would go, what would become of her now that everything she knew was gone, but she stayed silent. After a moment, he turned back to her. "Tomorrow," he said, his tone low, "we travel east, to the river." "Why?" she asked. "There is safety there," he replied. "And choice." She didn't understand. Choice? Between what and what? Before she could ask, he looked away, as if lost in thought. The firelight flickered against his profile, tracing the curve of his jaw, the faint scar near his temple. She wondered how many battles he had fought, how many lives he had seen fall. The cloak he had given her still held his warmth. She clutched it tighter, feeling something stir in her chest, something she couldn't name. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. It frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. He sat again, his back straight, his eyes watching the horizon as though he could already see the dawn. The night deepened around them, but neither moved. Somewhere in that silence a bond began to form, fragile, uncertain, yet real. When she finally whispered, "What happens after the river?" he didn't answer. He only stared into the distance, the reflection of the flames flickering in his eyes, as if he already knew that what waited beyond the river would change both their lives forever. The morning came quietly, with the first light spreading across the plains like a slow fire. The woman stirred beneath the Apache cloak, her mind still heavy with dreams of smoke and gunfire. When she opened her eyes, she found him already awake, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, sharpening a blade that looked older than either of them. His movements were calm, steady, and precise. Every motion told her he had done this countless times before. She sat up, pulling the cloak tighter around her shoulders. The air was cold enough to bite. He didn't look at her right away, but she could feel he knew she was watching. After a moment, he spoke without lifting his eyes. "We ride soon." Her gaze moved toward the small ridge where two horses stood tied. One was his dark, lean, and strong. The other she hadn't noticed before was smaller, white with brown patches, tired but gentle-eyed. He must have found it during the night. The thought startled her. She wondered how far he had gone while she slept and why he had returned. She rose slowly, her legs still weak from exhaustion. "Where are we going?" she asked again, hoping this time he'd explain more than a single word. He sheathed the blade and finally met her eyes. "To the river," he said, just as before. "It will hide our tracks." There was something in his tone, not secrecy, but caution, as if the world beyond those hills was no longer safe for either of them. She wanted to ask who might be following, but the answer frightened her too much to voice it. They packed in silence. The warrior moved like the land itself, quiet, deliberate, yet strong. Every time she glanced at him, she felt that strange mix of unease and gratitude. He had saved her, yes, but she didn't yet know why. As they rode out, the sun began to climb, brushing the horizon with pale gold. The land stretched endlessly before them, rolling hills, scattered trees, and dry grass whispering in the wind. The silence between them was filled with questions neither dared to ask. After a while she spoke softly. "You didn't tell me your name?" He looked straight ahead. "Names have meaning. They are not given easily." She frowned slightly. "Then what should I call you?" He hesitated for a moment before replying. "Call me what you see." She studied him, the lines on his face, the sharp calm in his eyes. "You look like someone who has carried too many burdens," she said. A faint smile ghosted across his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. "And I am burden." The way he said it made her feel both foolish and tender. She wanted to know his real name, but somehow she knew he wouldn't give it yet. She didn't press further. As the morning deepened, they reached a narrow pass where the land grew wild and twisted. The wind shifted, carrying the distant echo of hooves. He stopped suddenly, raising a hand. She froze. Through the stillness, she heard it too, riders, several of them. The sound was faint, but certain. Her heart began to race. He turned his horse toward her. "What? Keep riding east," he said quietly. "I tell you to run, you do not look back." She swallowed hard. "Who are they?" He didn't answer. His jaw tightened, and his hand rested lightly on the hilt of his knife. That silence was answer enough. Whoever they weren't friends. They rode faster, cutting through brush and dry creek beds until they reached the cover of tall pines. He dismounted and helped her down. The moment his hand brushed hers, she felt a shock of warmth, unexplainable and sharp. He didn't seem to notice. He led her into the trees, motioning for her to stay low. From there she could see the trail behind them, a line of riders approaching, their shapes dark against the dust. Soldiers, perhaps, or bounty hunters. Her breath caught. "They were looking for me." He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "No," he said, "they are looking for both of us." The realization struck her like cold water. "Why you?" He didn't answer right away. The sound of hooves grew louder. He moved closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "'Cause I broke their peace." She didn't understand, but there was no time to ask. He grabbed her hand and pulled her deeper into the forest. They moved fast, their feet silent on the pine needles. Behind them, the soldiers' voices echoed, rough, impatient, closing in. After a long sprint, he stopped near a fallen log and motioned for her to crouch. They hid there, hearts pounding. The soldiers passed just above the ridge, their horses snorting, their boots clattering against rock. One of them shouted something about the girl and the savage. She closed her eyes, praying they wouldn't find them. When the sound finally faded, she opened her eyes again. The warrior's hand was still on hers, firm and steady. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken truth. He released her hand slowly and stood. "You must decide what you are willing to leave behind." Her throat tightened. "I've already lost everything." "Not yet," he said. "There's still you." Something in his voice, the calm certainty, pierced through her fear. She realized then that his strength wasn't just in his arms or his weapons. It was in his will to protect, even when the world gave him nothing back. They continued their journey through the woods, keeping to the shadows. By evening, the trees opened to a wide clearing. A stream ran through it, reflecting the dying light of the sun. He stopped there, letting the horses drink. She knelt by the water, splashing her face, watching the ripples blur her reflection. The cloak hung heavy on her shoulders, a reminder of the night before. When she looked up, he was watching her again, not with suspicion, but with quiet wonder. "You are not like them," he said finally. "Like who?" she asked. "Those who come with fire and fear." "I didn't want this war," she whispered. "My father. He believed peace could come if we just—" She stopped, her voice breaking. The image of her father lying lifeless flashed before her eyes. He turned away, his gaze lost in the distance. "Your father was wrong," he said softly. "Peace does not come from words. It comes when both sides remember what it means to be human." His words lingered in the air long after he stopped speaking. She wanted to argue, but deep down, she knew he was right. The war had stolen more than lives. It had stolen kindness, trust, the ability to see one another as people. That night, they camped again, beneath a sky full of stars. She lay awake, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. Every so often, she would glance toward him. He sat near the fire, head bowed as if listening to something only he could hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "You said they are hunting you because you broke their peace. What did you mean?" He didn't look up. "There was a treaty," he said. "But treaties mean nothing to men who trade honor for gold. They took our land, our families. So I took something from them." Her chest tightened. "What? Their pride?" He lifted his eyes then, and the firelight reflected something fierce and sorrowful all at once. "They call it rebellion. I call it survival." She understood now the weight he carried, the silence he wore like armor. He wasn't a man without cause. He was a man burdened by too many of them. She wanted to tell him she wasn't afraid, but the words stuck in her throat. So instead, she whispered, "What happens if they catch us?" His eyes softened, and for the first time, he almost smiled. "Then you will see how far an Apache will go to keep his promise." The wind rose again, carrying with it the faint cry of wolves across the distance. She closed her eyes, clutching the cloak around her. Somewhere beyond that dark forest, danger waited, but so did destiny. And though she didn't yet know why, she felt that her life had already begun to change the moment he placed that cloak over her shoulders. The days that followed were long and quiet, filled with the rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through the plains. They kept close to the river, moving only when the sun began to set and resting when darkness hid their trail. The woman had grown used to the silence between them, yet every word he spoke still carried a weight that settled deep in her heart. The land around them seemed endless, stretching out like an old song without an end, and with every mile they traveled, the world she once knew drifted further behind her. The warrior rarely spoke of himself, but through small glimpses, she began to understand the world he came from. Sometimes, when the night was calm and the firelight softened his face, he would tell her pieces of his life. He spoke of the desert winds that carried the scent of mesquite and sage, of the songs his mother used to hum when the stars were bright, and of the brother he lost in the first raid. His words painted pictures that felt more alive than anything she had ever seen in her old town. Yet every memory seemed haunted by loss. She wanted to tell him about her world, too, about the fields where she used to run barefoot, about the small church bell that rang every Sunday, about the laughter that once filled her home but she couldn't bring herself to. Every image of her past felt like it belonged to someone else. She wasn't that girl anymore, not after what she had seen. One evening, as they camped near the bend of the river, the wind began to shift. He noticed it first. His eyes lifted toward the horizon where smoke curled faintly in the distance. He stood without a word and moved to the edge of the ridge. She followed him, her heart tightening when she saw what he saw. There was movement near the water, a small group of riders, moving slowly, searching. "Soldiers?" she whispered. He nodded. "They've found our trail." Her pulse quickened. "What do we do?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze swept the land, tracing paths she couldn't see. Finally, he said, "We move north. There's a canyon there, narrow but safe." They rode hard through the night. The river glimmered beside them, silver in the moonlight, and the air grew colder with every mile. The woman clung to the reins, her body aching, but she didn't complain. The fear of being caught pushed her forward. Behind them, the faint echo of hooves followed, steady and relentless. By dawn, they reached the edge of the canyon, a deep, winding cut through the land, hidden by brush and stone. He led the horses down a steep path and into the shadow of the cliffs. The air there was still and heavy, and the sound of the river above became distant. They found a small hollow near the canyon wall where the ground was soft and dry. She could see the exhaustion in his face. His movements were slower, his shoulders tense. When he finally sat down, she noticed a dark stain on his sleeve. "You're hurt," she said quickly. He looked down, as if only just realizing it. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Fabric was torn, and blood had soaked through the cloth. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling. "Let me see." He hesitated, then relented. The cut ran along his arm, deep but clean. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against the wound. He didn't flinch, though, his jaw tightened. "You should have told me," she said softly. "There was no time," he replied. She tied the cloth firmly, then looked up at him. His face was calm, but there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For the first time, he looked human, vulnerable. They rested there for hours, the weight of the silence pressing between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "Do you think they'll find us?" He stared at the canyon floor, where dust swirled faintly in the breeze. "If they do, we'll make our stand here." Her stomach turned at his words. "Can't fight them." "We may not have to," he said, though his tone held little conviction. That night the canyon grew cold. She couldn't sleep. The fire had burned low, and the shadows stretched long across the rock walls. The warrior sat apart from her, his eyes reflecting the dim glow of the embers. She watched him for a long time, wondering what he was thinking. "Do you ever wish you had stayed?" She asked quietly. He looked up. "Stayed where?" "With your people." He shook his head. "There was no place left for me," she hesitated, "because of the treaty." He nodded slowly. "I spoke against it. Chief said peace would save us. But peace bought with surrender is not peace. So I walked away." His voice held no anger, only tired truth. She realized then that his fight wasn't just against the soldiers, it was against a world that refused to understand. The next morning, they followed the canyon deeper. The path was rough, but it led to a clearing where a small stream ran through the rocks. There, the warrior stopped and crouched beside the water, running his hand through the cold current. "We'll stay here a while," he said. "They'll pass us by if we wait." She nodded, grateful for the rest, but unease still gripped her. The silence of the canyon felt too deep, too watchful. Later that afternoon, as she gathered dry wood, she saw something that made her freeze. On the ridge above, a flicker of movement, sunlight catching on metal. She dropped the branches and ran back. "There's someone up there," she said breathlessly. He stood instantly, his knife flashing in his hand. "How many?" "I don't know. Just a glint. Maybe one, maybe more." He motioned for her to stay back and climbed the rocks with careful steps. She waited below, her heart pounding, every second stretching like a lifetime. Minutes later, he returned, his face grim. "They have found us," he said quietly. Her breath caught. "What do we do?" He looked toward the northern end of the canyon. "There's a pass that leads to the plains. It's risky, but it's the only way out." She felt fear knotting in her chest, but she nodded. "Then we go." As they prepared to leave, she noticed the way his eyes scanned the ridges, sharp, alert, always searching. He was a man who had lived too long on the edge of danger. And yet beneath that hard exterior, she could sense something else growing, something that unsettled her as much as it comforted her. They rode fast, the canyon walls echoing with the thunder of hooves. The path narrowed, forcing them close. The warrior rode ahead, guiding the way through the maze of stone. Behind them, distant shouts rose, faint but closing in. The woman's heart hammered in her chest. Every sound felt louder, every shadow sharper. She could see the fear in the horse's eyes, the strain in its muscles, but she didn't stop, not until they reached the mouth of the canyon, where the land opened wide again. There the warrior halted and turned back. For a moment, he seemed to listen to the wind itself. Then he dismounted. "We part ways here," he said suddenly. She stared at him, stunned. "What? They're after me? If you stay with me, you'll die." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving you." He stepped closer, his expression firm. "You have no debt to me." Her voice broke. "I don't care about debt. You saved my life." "I'm not going to," he cut her off with a quiet but final tone. "Go east. There's a settlement 2 days' ride from here. Tell them nothing. Stay hidden." She wanted to argue, to refuse, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't cruelty. It was protection. He turned away, tightening the saddle straps. But before he could mount, she reached out and caught his arm. "You think you can fight them alone?" He looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face. "I've been fighting alone my whole life." The words stung more than she expected. She let her hand fall, her throat tight. He mounted his horse and looked back one last time. The wind lifted the edges of his cloak, the same one he had once given her. "Keep it," he said quietly. "It will remind you of what the world still owes the living." Then he rode off into the distance, his figure fading into the sunlit haze. She stood there long after he was gone, clutching the cloak close to her chest. The land around her was silent again, but it didn't feel empty. Somewhere out there, he was facing the storm alone. And deep down, she knew their paths were not finished. The river still called to both of them, winding through the land like fate itself, and whatever waited beyond it was not peace, but something far more dangerous. Something neither of them could yet escape. The night she watched him disappear into the haze stayed burned in her memory. For days the world felt too still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She rode east, just as he had told her, following the river's path through narrow valleys and patches of scorched grass. The cloak around her shoulders was her only comfort, carrying the faint scent of smoke and leather, a reminder of the man who had risked everything for her. But the silence was heavy, and it pressed harder the farther she went. Every sound in the wilderness made her turn. She began to realize that danger didn't always come riding in loud and fast. Sometimes it stalked quietly, waiting for fear to make its move. The farther she rode, the more she wondered if the soldiers still followed, or if they had found him instead. That thought clawed at her chest. He had vanished without a word, without even a promise. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't over. By the third night, she reached a small settlement near the edge of the plains, little more than a few cabins, a trading post, and a stable. The people there watched her with wary eyes, as if they could sense she carried something dangerous. When she asked for water, a woman pointed her toward the well, but said nothing. The silence in their gazes told her everything. Strangers were not welcome here. She stayed only long enough to rest her horse and refill her canteen. Before dawn, she was back on the trail. But something had changed. The air felt different, charged with something unseen. As she followed the river, she began to see signs, faint tracks along the bank. Broken twigs ash from a fire not long cold. Her pulse quickened. She knew his tracks now. She could recognize the pattern of his horse's hooves, the care in how he moved through the land. He was alive. That realization filled her with both relief and fear. If she had found his trail, others could too. She pressed on, every step a battle between reason and instinct. The tracks led her through a narrow valley, where the river curved sharply between red stone cliffs. The sound of water grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. Then from somewhere ahead came another sound, faint but unmistakable, the cry of a hawk and the low hum of a horse's breath. She moved carefully, guiding her horse through the shallows. The air smelled of rain and smoke, and then she saw him. He was by the riverbank, kneeling beside a small fire, his head bent as he cleaned a wound along his side. He looked thinner, harder, but he was alive. She almost called out, but something in his posture stopped her. There was tension in the way he moved, quick, guarded, like a man expecting to be hunted. When she finally stepped into the clearing, he looked up, and for a moment neither spoke. His eyes held surprise, then something sharper. "You should not have come back," he said quietly. "I couldn't just leave you," she answered. "They could have killed you." "They still might," he said, rising to his feet. "And now you've made yourself part of that." She didn't flinch. "I made that choice the night you gave me this cloak." He stared at her for a long moment, the wind tugging at the edge of his hair. Then he sighed and turned back to the fire. "You shouldn't have followed the river. They know its path." "Then where can we go?" she asked. He hesitated, then pointed toward the mountains in the far distance. "There's a place hidden in the cliffs, old ground my people once used when war came. Few know it still exists." She nodded, though fear twisted in her stomach. The mountains looked impossibly far, shrouded in mist. Still she followed. They rode for hours without rest, the sun climbing high above them. The air grew thin and dry. He spoke little, but she could sense the weight pressing on him. Every glance toward the horizon carried a quiet urgency. When they stopped to water the horses, she saw the strain in his eyes. Not fear for himself, but for her. By late afternoon, dark clouds began to gather. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something else smoke. He noticed it too. "They're close," he said. "How do you know?" "Because the wind always brings truth before it brings rain." They urged their horses onward, cutting through a narrow ravine that opened into a high plain. The storm broke overhead, thunder rolling through the sky. Rain fell hard, soaking them both. But it also masked their trail. They pressed forward until the light began to fade, and the mountain shadows stretched long across the land. Finally, they reached a sheltered plateau overlooking the valley. He dismounted and motioned for her to stay low. Below them, torches flickered, a line of riders moving through the rain, following the river's curve. "The soldiers are still tracking us," she whispered. He nodded, eyes fixed on the movement below. "They won't stop. You're not just after me anymore. You're proof of what they call betrayal." She turned to him. "Betrayal? They believe I turned against their agreement by saving you. To them, that makes you an accomplice." The truth hit her like cold steel. "So even if we run, they'll keep coming." He looked at her then, rain dripping from his hair, his face carved with exhaustion and resolve. "Yes, until one of us is gone." The storm raged around them as they found shelter beneath a ledge. He built a small fire from dry kindling hidden in his saddlebag, shielding it from the wind. The flames danced weakly, but the light between them was enough to see the truth written on their faces: fear, exhaustion, and something deeper neither dared name. She wanted to ask what he would do when the soldiers reached them, but the words stayed locked inside. Instead, she asked softly, "If you could go back, would you still have helped me?" He didn't look up. "Yes, even knowing it would cost you everything." He finally met her eyes. "Everything I lost before was taken by force. This time I chose it." His voice was low, but the meaning struck her hard. It wasn't just sacrifice, it was purpose. They didn't sleep that night. The storm faded near dawn, leaving the land drenched and silent. From the ridge she could see faint smoke rising in the valley. The soldiers had made camp. The hunt would continue with daylight. The warrior packed quickly, his movements sharp, efficient. When she asked where they were going next, he said to the high caves, "Once we reach them, we'll have the ground on our side." The climb was steep and treacherous. Loose stones slipped under the horses' hooves, and cold wind whipped through the cracks in the cliffs. Her fingers went numb, but she refused to fall behind. Glanced back once, his eyes filled with quiet pride, though he said nothing. By midday, they reached a narrow ledge that opened into a hidden pass. The air there was thin, filled with the scent of sage and rain-soaked rock. From that height, they could see the entire valley, the river winding like a silver thread, the smoke of the soldiers' camp below.
Ow.
For a brief moment, she felt they might finally be safe. But then came the sound that shattered the silence, the distant crack of a rifle. The echo rolled through the canyon walls. A bird burst from the rocks nearby, startled into flight. He turned sharply, eyes scanning the ridge. "They've seen us." Before she could react, another shot rang out. Stone splintered near her feet. He pulled her down, shielding her with his body, the air filled with dust and the sharp scent of gunpowder. "We need to move," he said, grabbing her hand. They ran along the ledge, the sound of gunfire chasing them. Path twisted and narrowed, forcing them close to the rock wall. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned out everything else. When they finally reached a break in the cliffs, he pushed her toward a small opening barely wide enough to crawl through. "Go," he shouted. "What about you?" "I'll draw them away." She shook her head desperately. "No, you can't fight them alone." He looked at her, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop. The rain, the wind, the sound of gunfire, all of it faded. "You're the reason I still fight," he said quietly. "Go." Tears blurred her vision, but she obeyed, crawling through the narrow passage into the darkness beyond. She turned back once, just in time to see him step out onto the open ledge, the wind whipping his cloak like a banner. Then came another gunshot, louder, closer. The sound echoed through the canyon, and the world went still once more. She pressed her hand against the cold rock, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. Somewhere beyond that narrow wall, the warrior stood alone against the storm that had finally found him. And as the light began to fade, she knew this was not the end. It was the edge of something far greater. The moment before fate decided which of them would fall and which would rise again. The sound of gunfire faded slowly into the wind, carried away across the canyon until it became just another whisper in the mountains. Inside the narrow crevice, she stayed pressed against the stone, her hands trembling. The world outside had fallen silent, but her heart refused to calm. Every second stretched like eternity as she waited for some sign, some sound that would tell her he was still alive. But there was nothing. Only the faint drip of water and the echo of her own breath. When the silence became too heavy to bear, she crawled out into the open. The rain had stopped, and a gray mist rolled through the valley below. Da-da-da-da. The ledge was empty, the ground scattered with broken stone, and the dark marks of gunfire. Her eyes searched desperately, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then by the edge of the cliff she saw movement, faint, unsteady. It was there. He was leaning against the rock, one hand pressed to his side where blood stained his clothes. But he was alive. Relief flooded through her so quickly that her knees nearly gave out. She ran to him, catching his arm before he could fall. "You shouldn't have come back," he murmured, his voice weak but steady. She shook her head, her eyes wet. "You already told me that once. I didn't listen then either." He tried to smile, though pain shadowed his face. "You never do." She helped him sit, tearing a strip from her cloak to press against his wound. The bullet had grazed his ribs, not deep enough to kill, but bad enough to bleed. As she worked, his eyes stayed on her, not with pride or regret, but with quiet wonder, as if he couldn't believe she was real. "They'll come again," she said softly. "Not today," he whispered. "The mountain hides us now." Below, the valley lay still, shrouded in fog. No torches moved, no voices carried. It seemed the soldiers had lost their trail in the storm. For the first time in days, there was no sound of pursuit, only the distant rush of water from the river below. She stayed beside him through the night, feeding the fire, keeping watch as he rested. The cloak he had given her was now torn and blood-stained, but she wrapped it around them both, guarding him against the cold. At times his breathing grew shallow, and she feared he might not wake again. But each time the wind stirred, his hand found hers, and that small strength gave her hope. When dawn finally came, the sky glowed pale gold over the peaks. The storm clouds had lifted, leaving behind a washed-clean world. The air smelled of rain and earth. He stirred then, his eyes opening slowly. She smiled faintly, exhausted but relieved. "You're still here," he said. "I told you I wasn't leaving." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded as if accepting something he had long tried to deny. "You should go east, as I said before. There's a trail down the ridge. It leads to the plains. You'll find people there." She shook her head. "I'm not going without you." He tried to protest, but the look in her eyes silenced him. She wasn't the frightened girl he had first found in the ashes of her town. The days on the run had changed her. She had learned to endure, to fight, and to care for someone beyond her own survival. "Then we go together," he said quietly. They waited until the sun rose higher, giving them light to travel. The climb down was slow and painful, but he leaned on her when his strength failed. Each step felt like a small victory. By the time they reached the lower pass, the valley had grown quiet again, as if the land itself was giving them safe passage. When they stopped to rest near a stream, he spoke again, his voice softer than before. "You asked once why I helped you," he said. "I think I know now." She looked at him curiously. "I saw something in you that I thought had died in this land. Kindness. Hope. When the war came, everyone stopped seeing people. They only saw sides. You reminded me what it means to see again." His words struck deep. She didn't know what to say, so she just held his gaze. "And you," she said after a pause, "reminded me that courage doesn't always wear a uniform." He smiled faintly at that, though his eyes glistened with something she had never seen before: peace. They continued for another day, following the river east. The land softened the farther they went. Trees began to return, the ground less harsh. Birds called from the branches, their cries carrying through the still air. It was as if the world itself was healing. At sunset, they reached the edge of the plains where wildflowers grew in small clusters among the rocks. There, they stopped. He sank to his knees, breathless, his strength nearly gone. She knelt beside him, afraid but calm. "You'll be safe here," he said quietly. "The soldiers won't come this far. They never look for peace where they cannot understand it." She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. "We both will be safe." He looked toward the horizon, where the light faded into deep gold. "My people believe that when a man's journey is done, his spirit joins the wind. Maybe that's what I've been chasing all along, the place where the wind rests." "Don't talk like that," she whispered. "You're not done yet." He smiled faintly. maybe not. But if I fall, promise me you'll keep going. Promise you'll tell them what happened here, not the war. Not the hate, but that an Apache and a woman from another world shared one cloak and found mercy in it. Tears welled in her eyes. I promise. He squeezed her hand once, strong despite the pain. Then he closed his eyes, leaning back against the rock, breathing in the quiet air. She stayed beside him, watching the last light fade. The world seemed to hold still, as if honoring the moment. When the stars appeared, she built a small fire. Its glow flickered against his face, soft and calm. She didn't know how long she sat there, only that time no longer felt like something to fear. The river hummed nearby, carrying its song eastward. By morning, the wind had changed again. The sky was clear, the air warm. He stirred and opened his eyes. To her surprise, he smiled. You see, he said weakly. The wind still remembers. She laughed through her tears, helping him to his feet. Together, they began the slow walk toward the plains. The land stretched endlessly before them, open and bright. Every step felt lighter, as if the past had loosened its hold. When they finally reached the open fields, she turned back for one last look at the mountains. The peaks stood tall against the sky, silent witnesses to everything that had passed between them. She thought of all the fear, the pain, and the small miracles that had brought them here. He stopped beside her, his voice low. The mountains are never the same when you leave them, he said. They remember you, even when you forget them. She nodded, understanding in her heart that their journey had changed more than just their lives. It had healed something broken in the land itself. They kept walking until the horizon blurred in the distance. Cloak still hung around her shoulders, heavy with history, but light with meaning. Every time the wind brushed against it, she thought she could hear the echo of his voice, calm and certain, reminding her that mercy and strength could live in the same heart. Years later, people would tell stories about that time of battles and loss, of broken treaties and vanished tribes. But somewhere between those lines, a quieter story would survive, one not written in blood or glory, but in the warmth of a single gesture. A warrior offering his only cloak to a stranger in need, and the woman who refused to let that act be forgotten. In the end, the story of the Apache warrior and the woman by the river was not about war or defeat. It was about two souls who found each other in the ruins of what was left, and in that fragile meeting, reminded the world that even in the harshest lands, compassion could still grow. The wind moved through the plains once more, carrying their memory with it, not as sorrow, but as peace. And wherever it blew, it whispered the same truth to those who would listen, that sometimes the smallest kindness can outlast an entire war.